Hello, everybody. Welcome to this presentation of the American Topical Association. Our presentation today is called Social Philately, a Window to the Past. It, the, the philatelic covers and cards in our collections have interesting stories to tell. These stories are often enhanced by related printed material, such as picture postcards and letters. Jean Wang is one of our most popular speakers, and she will explore stories from medical history as illuminated by social philately. Jean's exhibit, Blood, A Modern Medicine, won the Grand Award at the National Topical Stamp Show competition in 2023. So, Jean, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Eric. So just to preface my talk, this is the first time I've given this as a sort of formal talk. So I was tweaking my slides right up until about half an hour ago. So I've been thinking about this concept of social philately and how to make this, sort of an interesting talk that sort of appeals, to everybody and doesn't get too dry. So what I'm going to talk about is, just sort of thinking about what exactly is social philately. And I think social philately has probably existed for a long time, but maybe only, in the last little while has been sort of formally defined and formally recognized as a sort of class, for exhibiting and so on. It's a subclass of postal history. But I think there's a lot of different ways to think about social philately and a lot of different levels at which we can practice social philately, if you want to put it that way. So I'm just going to present sort of a high level overview of what I think are different ways to explore this, phenomenon called social philately. And then to kind of give it a little bit more granularity, I looked online and emailed a few people that I know and asked for or looked for examples of exhibits that are out there that I think fall under these sort of classes or types of social philately. And then at the very end, I'm going to give you a couple examples from my own collections of how one can start or, tell a social philatelic story and how I kind of stumbled on a couple of these. I certainly didn't set out to be a, social philatelist or anything, but as I've collected things, I've built little side collections that have grown, sort of organically. And eventually I had enough material that I could start to see a story coming out of it. So this, this ties in very much with my love of topical and thematic collecting and telling stories in topical and thematic exhibiting. But, this is sort of an offshoot, which we'll get into. So that's kind of the outline of what I'm going to talk about. So social philately. So, when I was kind of trying to think about how to define this, I think philatelists as a group, we collect history, right? So I Googled historical documents and a bunch of pictures came up, and this was one example. So, people who study history or historians typically use written material, printed material, books, letters, photographs, postcards. And a lot of this material overlaps with what we collect as philatelists. So these are just, this is just a collage of some of the items from one of my collections, which I'm going to talk to you about near the end of my talk. But, you can see that a lot of the material is very similar, right? Letters, postcards, envelopes, other, written letters, printed letters. So I think, and we've had talks about ephemera. Ephemera, when I looked at the definition of ephemera is defined as things that exist or are used or enjoyed for only a short time. So these were things that were not meant to be permanent. So, other than books, I think in that picture on the left, all of these other things were, they were meant to be, a letter was like written, sent, meant to be read, and then, probably not saved, although a lot of people did save letters. So this was often written or printed material. And these are, that's where the word ephemeral comes from, right? They're temporary or transient, but a lot of people kept these, and these are a great source of historical knowledge. And I think for us as philatelists, when we collect these kinds of things, anything that has a philatelic connection, that philately provides additional layers of information on all this ephemeral material, right? Because I think what we collect as philatelists falls under the umbrella of ephemera, but has this added dimension and provides, directionality, where the letters came from, where they were sent to, and, those can provide interesting details into some of the backstories. So, social philately, I think, when I was sort of thinking about this, I thought, I think there's kind of maybe three main types of social philately. So here's one example. This is a fellow that I've met online. His name is Peter Congreve. He has a blog where he presents himself as a social historian. So a philatelist as social historian. And if you look at his blog, and the web address is down there, he posts letters and covers where he's taken a deep dive into that particular letter. So, this is just one example. When I looked at his website a couple of weeks ago, this was the featured one. And a philatelist might look at the stamps, might analyze the route that the letter took. But what he does is he asks more social questions, right? Who was the sender? Who was the addressee? What was the relationship between the sender and the person they were sending the letter to? Why was the letter sent at all? So he takes really deep dives into the people that are connected to this letter. And he researches like sites like Ancestry or other sites where you can dig into family history, where people lived, the kind of jobs they had. So I think I sort of call this kind of social philately biographical or genealogical philately, where you're really focusing on one item and doing a really deep dive into that one item. So this is one kind of social philately that I think, is very interesting and potentially has, can reveal a lot of really interesting stories, but has a more narrow focus. The other two, I think, sort of main kinds of social philately are more what I would call societal philately, where you're looking at the interaction of the postal system with society as a whole. So events, local or world events, commerce and industry, historical geography, right? The development of places over time. So all of these things, and this is certainly not an exclusive list, but just some of the kind of broad categories that we think of when we think of society and how society evolves over time. And so I think there's two ways, again, here to kind of look at the interaction of the postal system with society. So one would be looking at how the postal system itself impacted society, because you can imagine unexplored territory, and as the postal system developed, it brought with it settlements and transportation, maybe a railway system. That's how the mail was delivered. And so there can be interesting stories of how the development of a postal system impacted society, how it impacted commerce and industry. And so that's a very direct link from the postal system to society. So I think that's one form of what we can think of as social philately. Another form, which I think is where my interests lie, and the kinds of areas that I've become interested in fall under this second umbrella, which is telling a social story. So some aspect of society, whether it's about a business or in my case, medical aspects of society, and focusing on those as the primary story, but telling the story using material that was developed for use in the postal system. So cards that were meant to be mailed, or letters or covers, it is still philatelic material. So it was material that was meant to go through the post. But when you collect that material, it tells you the story of the people that were using that material. And I'll give you a couple examples at the end from my own collection. But in both of these kinds of social philately, the social information really provides the main thread of the story. So you're focusing on the social history and the philatelic information supports the social history. So that I think is where, social philately is different from, say, postal history. But you can also include non-philatelic material. So this is other ephemera, which is directly relevant to the subject that you're talking about, and it helps you to illustrate the story. And I'll give you some examples of that as well. So for the next, few slides, I'm going to just give you some examples of exhibits that I knew about, or, I did kind of a browse through some of the online exhibit websites like AAPE and other online exhibits. And plus I asked a few exhibitors of who had exhibits that I knew about that I thought would fit well. And this is certainly, again, not an exhaustive list. This is just a few examples to just kind of illustrate the ideas that I've been thinking about. So for the first category of how the postal system impacted society, this, is a wonderful exhibit. So it was is an exhibit by Vince King. He sadly passed away last year. But his exhibit is actually preserved on Richard Frajola's website. So you can actually download the entire exhibit at this link that I've put on the slide down here. It's a wonderful exhibit. I really encourage you to take a look at it. It won the Champion at Champions, I think, 1 or 2 years ago. But basically, he shows how the very beginning of postage stamps, right? Different countries illustrating or issuing adhesive postage stamps, how the hobby of or the passion for stamp collecting got started, right? Because of course, before stamps, there was no stamp collecting. And how did stamp collecting get started? So he has this exhibit where he shows all the, he goes through like the first issues of all these different countries and postal administrations. And in parallel, he shows how, accounts of people starting to collect these things. And at first people thought, oh, they're crazy. Why are they collecting these little pieces of paper? And, so it's a very interesting story of how stamp collecting came to be. And he uses, he has a lot of postal history because he has a lot of these first stamp issues. But then as you get towards the last 2 or 3 frames, it becomes 3-dimensional. So when you download the scans, if you download the scans of his exhibit, you'll see the last 2 or 3 frames, he's actually built out boxes to contain like books, stamp albums. This is just one example of the world's oldest documented stamp collection and album. Where they just glued stamps into a book here. So, it's a really fascinating look at how the hobby of stamp collecting got started. So this is a great example of how the postal system influenced society, right? So this is a great social philately story. Here's another exhibit from Chip Gleedman. So you can find the whole exhibit. Again, he has his own website and he's got all his exhibits online. So you can find the entire exhibit. It's a 1-frame exhibit, which illustrates the mail routes of Rupert's Land in British North America. So these were routes that were used to move supplies, furs, and mail into the sort of north of Ontario, where Hudson's Bay Company basically was developed a fur trade in that area. So his exhibit actually really just focuses on postal history. So he's got all these amazing covers that were, illustrate all these different routes and where they went. But his exhibit really only focuses on the postal history. So he doesn't really talk about the commerce and the industry. But I think, here's an example of how this kind of postal history exhibit could really be, has the potential to be developed into a social philately exhibit if you start to look at how these routes impacted commerce. And maybe you could find other material, not necessarily covers, but other documentation of how the trading routes grew alongside the mail routes. So, this is something that could, so I think this kind of social history where you're looking at how the postal system impacted society is very very tightly linked to postal history. And that's why I think social philately or social philately became a sub category of postal history. So I think it's category 2C in the FIP classification. So now looking at the second group, which is telling a social story not necessarily, related to the postal system at all. So the story itself is not related to the postal system, but to tell the story, you use material that was developed for use in the postal system. So this could be postcards, letters, covers, like anything that went through the mail, basically, or was developed in order to process the mail, sort the mail, etc. So, this is one example. This is a friend of mine who lives in Montreal, Alexandra Glashan. She has a one frame postcard exhibit where she's telling the story of the, expat Irish community, Irish immigrants, and how they came together as a community. And she illustrates that story using St. Patrick's Day postcards, and the illustrations on the front of the postcards looking at the different sort of themes, links to their homeland back home, different designs, and how they, remembered stuff from back home. So it's a postcard exhibit. She only uses the fronts of the postcards. And a lot of times in postcard exhibits, the message on the back is not necessarily related to the story that you're trying to tell, right? So she's telling a social philately or a social history about these Irish immigrants, but the stories on the back or the messages written on the back are not often, I would say, usually not related to the image on the front. So she's really using the images on the front, but the message on the back might be some mundane thing like, I'm well, or the weather's good, the kind of things people write in postcards, right? But has nothing to do with the picture on the front of the postcard. So she just uses the fronts of the postcards. So that's with picture postcards. Dawn, of course, Dawn Hammond has a number of really wonderful postcard exhibits. I really love this one. She has a one frame exhibit that talks about Edwin Costin, who was an entrepreneur who decided that he was going to build a business selling ostrich feathers to American women, as part of fashion, right? So she has a lot of picture postcards in this exhibit to tell this very specific story about, this one guy, Edwin Costin, and how he built his business farming ostriches and selling ostrich feathers to American women. But she also has some pages where she has non-philatelic ephemera. So here's a magazine ad from the Ladies' Home Journal, and here's an order form from his business. And so these are non-philatelic items that are specifically related to the topic she's talking about. So she's not, using some generic magazine ad or anything like that, but something specific to this guy's business. And that helps her to tell the story, right? How he promoted this fashion, how the feathers could be ordered. So all of this helps to tell the sort of backstory in addition to the philatelic material. Here's another example. This is just an exhibit I found online. So it's a multi-frame exhibit that talks about the Natal Rebellion of 1906. And he uses military and related civilian mail from that conflict. So soldiers that were sending mail back home, picture postcards that were issued around that area that had pictures, relevant pictures of the conflict. And he uses these to tell the story of the rebellion. So really this is, he may not call it that, but this is, I think, in my view, this is kind of like this is a social philately exhibit where he's using the philatelic material to actually tell the story about this rebellion in 1906. And the difference between picture postcards and postal cards, like military, or postal cards that were mailed that don't have a picture on the front, is often for one thing, you can read the message on the back, right? So if you have covers that don't have contents, you don't really know what the message was inside, unless you're lucky enough to have the contents retained. But for postal cards, the advantage of postal cards is that not only do you have the philatelic information that tells you where it was sent from, who it was sent to, when it was sent, but you have the message on the back. And in this case, I think these messages often are or can be relevant, especially if you find, postcards that were sent by soldiers back home. They often talk about what was happening, in the unit, in the camp, whatever. So, this is just one page that I picked from his exhibit where he talks about, he shows this particular postcard, and the message on the back is related to the scene from this, picture, the non-philatelic picture that he has on the next page. So, this is another example of how you can use philatelic material to tell a social philately story. So, how does one go about building a social philately collection? I mean, I certainly, when I started out, I would say for most of my philatelic career, if you want to call it that, I was a stamp collector. So I collected stamps from several different countries and I put them into my albums, and I didn't really collect anything else other than stamps. And it was only, maybe a dozen years ago or so, I started to collect a topic, which was blood donation and blood transfusion. And in the process of collecting that topic, I started to find all this other related material that was not stamps, including, postmarks and postal stationery, um, covers, illustrated covers, meter slogans, all kinds of other stuff that was not stamps, but was related to my topic. So I started to collect all that too. And I started to learn about all these other sorts of material that you can collect. And then that eventually broadened out into, because I'm a physician, so I got interested in other aspects of medical philately. So when I came across stuff, I would, if it looked interesting to me, I would collect it, especially if it wasn't that expensive. So, eventually I've come to sort of build some collections that have social history, social philately stories behind them. But, it's not like I said, okay, here's a story I want to talk about, and I'm going to go and find material. Usually I think it's the other way around, because ultimately we're all stamp collectors, right? We're all philatelists. We all start with the philatelic material, and then out of that philatelic material, as we build our collections, stories emerge, right? And this is kind of the classic, when I talk about the difference between topical and thematic. A topical collection is a collection where everything has a picture of the thing you're collecting, right? So butterflies, for example. Whereas when you start to collect things that are related to like butterfly migration or butterfly, how they pollinate plants and the different kinds of plants and their habitats, and you start to collect material around that, that becomes a thematic collection, and then you start to build a story out of that. So I think it's exactly the same with the social philately collection, where you find material, you start to collect, you don't know where it's going to end up, and then as you collect it, you start to see a story coming together. So, so I want to give you a couple examples from my collections. One will be about the Hospital for Sick Children, and the second one, which I'm going to spend a bit more time on, is something that I've become really interested in this past year, which is British and Canadian tobacco funds that sent cigarettes and tobacco to soldiers that were fighting in World War I. So just a brief overview of the Hospital for Sick Children. And I wanted to talk about this one in particular because this was really my first foray, I would say, into like social philately. And I really, kind of stumbled upon it accidentally. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't even that conscious, I think, at that point, of the kinds of things you could collect other than stamps. So, but, I was starting to get into, I was interested in blood donation postcards and things like that, postcards that clinics would mail out to remind people about their blood donor appointment. And so I was, at a stamp show, and I was looking through a dealer's box looking for postcards and things related to medicine. And I came across this postcard that was mailed by the Hospital for Sick Children. So in Toronto, there's a very large internationally renowned pediatric hospital called the Hospital for Sick Children. So this card, I came across this card, and I was interested in it because on the back of the card, there was this illustration of, before and after pictures of club feet, which is, it's a sort of malformation that some children are born with, and it can be corrected by orthopedic surgery. And if you don't correct it, the children really are, and this is like this is 1909. So children were lame if they couldn't really walk properly unless you corrected this malformation. So, I had no idea what this was. I ended up buying it because it was, it was interesting. I didn't really know anything about it. I didn't know the Hospital for Sick Children, why they would issue this card. It had kind of an interesting picture on the front of a woman holding a baby. Looked a little bit religious to me, but not overtly. So I bought it, and I didn't, like I said, I just was curious about it. So over the next few years, anytime I saw a card from the Hospital for Sick Children, I collected. And, I started to, once I got a few of them, I actually started to look for them online and in various dealer stock. And so eventually I built up a little collection of these, and you can see that there's a lot of variety in the pictures on the front. This picture here is actually a picture of the stained glass window that uh, the the hospital, the board, the chairman of the board commissioned when they built the sort of big hospital building. But again, I was collecting these cards. Hadn't really researched any background. I just thought they were pretty, and I was collecting them for the variety of cards. And then I came across at a stamp show, I came across some of these envelopes that were illustrated envelopes. There was nothing on the back, but in the corner was a little illustration from the Hospital for Sick Children. And again, illustration usually of a nurse with a child. And I found a few of these. So the earlier ones had a little caption here, sick but not neglected. And the later ones had the same illustrations, but no caption anymore. And so I started to, talk about these at my local stamp club. I kind of did a show and tell. And then one of the other members of one of the clubs said, "Oh, I have a little package." So he gave me this. It was one of those covers, the illustrated covers that actually had the contents still. So it was a booklet. This is just opened out, but it was like a little booklet that would fit into one of those small envelopes, and a letter. And the letter was basically, it was mailed in December, and it was basically a fundraising appeal asking for donations to support the operations of the hospital. And this little booklet had all kinds of photos in it of the hospital operations, children who were sick, like before and after pictures, lists of the nurses, lists of the doctors, like all kinds of really interesting information. And I really loved, the flowery language on the letter. So here, your money can keep the golden hinges on the doors of the hospital's mercy. So, I started to like really think, okay, there's an interesting story here, right? So I started to look into it. I found a few postcards that showed the Hospital for Sick Children building here. And when I started to dig into it, I found, there's this whole fascinating backstory of John Ross Robertson, who became the main benefactor of the hospital. He was the publisher of the Toronto Evening Telegram. He became the chairman of the board of trustees of the hospital in 1891 and served as the chair until he died in 1918. He became very involved in the hospital because he lost a little niece. Uh, um, I can't remember, it was just scarlet fever or something. And so he became very involved in the operations of the hospital. And every Christmas, he would dress up as Santa, and he would pull us, he would bring a pony pulling a sleigh full of toys onto the wards, and they would give out toys to all the children. I actually have a postcard showing, Santa with all the kids and the nurses. And when I dug into the history of the hospital, I found this whole um, story where the hospital, provided, the mandate of the hospital was to provide care to all children in Ontario, regardless of if their parents were able to pay or not. And so they did receive some funding from the government, and they got funding. They had some patients that were able to pay, but they relied heavily on public donations to sort of fill the gap so that they could provide care to all children, including those whose parents weren't able to pay. And so every Christmas, they would mail out letters and these booklets to all, very widely in Ontario, asking for donations. And those postcards were sent to acknowledge receipt of donations. So on the back, they would say, "Thank you very much for your donation." They would write in the amount of the donation, and it would be signed by the secretary treasurer. And the fronts of the cards, you can see that the pictures, the ads that were printed on the front of the cards evolved over time. So these were very early ones in Queen Victoria's time, then King Edward. than King George. And later on, the pictures became less and less religious, overtoned, and eventually just had a picture of a child. So there was this whole interesting story of how the hospital transformed from its roots as it was established by a small group of women who really established it in a small building as a sort of charity to care for children. And when Robertson became involved, he sort of transformed it into this really modern, secular hospital that embraced, modern medical science and technology, and basically was, a big factor in transforming the hospital into what it is today. And so eventually I put everything together into a one-frame exhibit that kind of told that story of the hospital. And so I think this is a perfect, it's a wonderful social philately story that basically came about because I found a card in a dealer stock that I didn't know anything about. And gradually over the years, as I collected more material, it gelled and it became a story. So I think, this is how these stories can evolve when we, and I would say when you go to a stamp show, keep an open mind because you never know what you're going to come across. You never know what interesting story might lie behind whatever it is that you find, right? So if you see something that looks kind of cool, not too expensive, go for it. Maybe there's a cool story behind it. So, I just gave a very quick overview. If you're interested in the story of the hospital, I did give a talk about this for my local stamp club, and the recording of that talk is on our stamp club's YouTube channel. So it is available if you want to go and, spend 40 minutes or so with that story. So the last story that I just will tell you about is something that I've been working on, pretty I wouldn't say intensely, but pretty enthusiastically, I would say, over the last year. I've been collecting this material for a long time, but really it's in the last year or so that I've gotten really interested in figuring out the story behind it. So, I joined an online stamp forum called Stamp Boards, maybe 2012 or something like that. And I started posting about my thematic exhibit, when I started out my exhibit about blood and how it developed. And I started this whole thread showing how my exhibit has evolved. And one year, as a sort of fun thing, I started a new thread where I was, trying to get people interested in thematic exhibiting. So I would post a few items that I was using in my exhibit and do a kind of quiz where I asked people, what do you think, number one, what's the philatelic story behind this item? And how do you think I'm connecting it to my thematic story? So I went through this whole thing. And then one of the people that had participated in it when it was finished said, oh, can I post some stuff from my exhibit? And he had an exhibit all about tobacco. And so I said, sure, always looking to learn new things. And so he posted, one of the items he posted was this card. And I'd never seen it before. Had no idea what it was. And so what it is, so it's from 1915. It's from World War I. It shows a soldier sitting on a carton here and he's smoking, and it, are we downhearted, which is a line from a song, something about Tipperary. I can't remember right now off the top of my head. But so what this is, it's a World War I smokes acknowledgement card. So in World War I, there were all these charitable foundations, a lot of newspapers, local and national newspapers, organizations like the Overseas Club, which was a sort of social organization of expat Britons. And they all raised money to send cigarettes and tobacco to the soldiers that were fighting overseas, because there was this idea, for one thing, it's World War I. They didn't know anything about, the dangers of tobacco and smoking. It was felt that, it was a comfort to the soldiers that they could smoke. It was a distraction from the horrors of the trenches. It covered up the smell of the trenches. If soldiers were bored, it gave them something to do. It was a reminder from home. So there were all these reasons why people raised money to send these smokes, and it became kind of a patriotic thing that, you donated money to send tobacco to soldiers overseas. And in every package of smokes, they would include a postcard that had the name and address of the donor, the person who had donated money to send that parcel. So here you can see a name and address of someone in Karachi in this case. And the soldier could write on the back, thanks for the smokes, and then mail it in the military postal system, and it would go back to the donor. And so, you know, millions of these probably were sent, or at least hundreds of thousands, but they're actually not that easy to find. Anyway, so I had never seen this before. He explained what it was, and I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. And so I didn't really think much about it after that. But then 2 years later, so I was at GAS, or not GAS, it was the American Topical Association National Topical Stamp Show. So this was before they merged and it became GAS. So this was in Milwaukee. And again, I was just browsing through dealers' boxes and I came across this card. And I remembered, that, okay, this is a smokes card, it's a smokes acknowledgement card. It was kind of crumpled up, but I think it was $10, so it wasn't that expensive. And I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. I mean, there is a connection to health for me, right? So I'm interested in medical philately. This was a tobacco card. So I bought it. And on the back of it, this looks a bit different than the other one, right? So this one, it's from the Overseas Club. It's got the address of the Overseas Club on the front. So it doesn't have the name and address of the donor on the front. It has the name and address of the donor on the back in this case. So this is a US donor. And the message here, it's written by a British soldier, sent from a British field post office. So I bought it. I put it in my binder. I didn't really think much about it. But then over the years, anytime I came across one, I would buy it. And so after a while, I built up quite a few of these. And earlier this year, or last year, I guess, 2024, after I bought one, I was putting it in my album and I was looking at them and I realized, I have pretty good variety here. There's different cartoons on them. Some of them have stamps on them. This one has a postage due. They're addressed to people all over the place, right? This one's to Australia. There are a bunch to Canada, then, a bunch to England. Like, what's the deal with these, right? Like, what's the story? So I started to look a little more into it. And you see this one here, this cartoon says Afamo Kaiser, which is basically the British soldier, lighting up his cigarette and saying, just hold on a minute, Kaiser, let me just have my smoke. So it's a little bit irreverent. And I actually found a postcard. So this is just a picture postcard that has this postcard or this picture on it. And I, did a little reading online and I found this was a cartoon that was drawn by Bert Thomas. He later became a political cartoonist, but he was a soldier in the artists' rifles or something. There was actually a unit of soldiers made up of artists. And this was on the back of this postcard again was some printing from the Overseas Club, right? So that first smokes card I bought was from the Overseas Club, and it's got an ad here about how much you donate and what it buys in terms of the amount of cigarettes and tobacco. So I started to collect these other things too, and I started to look for postcards to show this impact of like smoking and the soldiers in World War I. So you could find, this is a postcard from a series of Daily Mail battle pictures, and it says a fag after a fight. So a fag is a British slang for a cigarette. So these soldiers just had a fight and now they're relaxing with a smoke. This one, it's from a Canadian series from the Daily Mirror showing, here's a wounded soldier, he's getting bandaged up on one side and they're lighting him up on the other side. And this actually I actually came across, because I was researching, looking for articles about smoking in World War I. And I actually found this photo in Library and Archives Canada so it's from September 1916, and the caption on the photo was, though badly wounded, he enjoys a cigarette. So they took the image from this photo and made a postcard out of it. You can find other things too. So there's all these different funds. This particular one is from the Belgian Soldiers Tobacco Fund. So this is also organized by the Overseas Club. Belgium was occupied by Germans. And so King Albert of Belgium asked, because the Belgian people weren't able to raise money to send cigarettes to their own soldiers. So King Albert asked for help from the Overseas Club, and they made a special fund where they went to US donors to ask them for money to send cigarettes to Belgian soldiers. And the reason, and this is the same as the first card I bought, the address of the overseas club is on the front, and the donor in the US, the address is on the back, because there was no free mail from the Western Front to the US, because the US initially wasn't involved in the war, and then they didn't want the donors to be charged postage due. So what they did was they collected the cards in London because there was free postage back to London. The soldiers didn't have to put a stamp, and then the overseas club would gather all these cards and then send them to the US donors so that the US donors wouldn't get charged postage due. So there's an interesting philatelic story behind it. That was the same reason for the other card that was sent to a US donor. The other cool thing about this card, and I didn't know at the time when I bought it, but I asked a friend to translate the Dutch for me, and he said, oh, it's sent by, it says Belgisch Veloleger, which is a bicycle soldier. So I didn't know about this. I researched it a little bit, and there were units of soldiers that went on bicycles because bicycles were very portable. They were quiet, so they could go by stealth into areas and just put the bikes down. And all these interesting aspects of the social history behind these cards started to come to light. Somewhere along the line, and I don't remember where I got this, I bought this collection booklet for the Belgian Soldiers Tobacco Fund. So it's a complete booklet. A couple of the pages inside got stuck together, but it's a complete booklet. It's got some information here about, the fund and the different amounts of cigarettes and tobacco that you could send. And it's got 40 coupons here. So the person who had the booklet would collect 25 cents from 40 different people and give them a coupon when they donated 25 cents. And then once you collected all 40 coupons, then you would send that money to the tobacco fund, and they would send the cigarettes overseas. So this is a really cool piece of ephemera that helps me to tell that story. And then, I realized that not only, you could donate money to send cigarettes and tobacco to soldiers overseas, but you could also direct the soldier or the smokes to go to specific soldiers or specific units. And so sometimes you'll get cards back with a very personal message on it. So in this case, the card is addressed Dear Francie, and it's signed Lovingly Ben. So clearly, Francie said, oh, I want to send these smokes to this particular soldier. So, this is another really cool aspect of how these funds worked. Soldiers outnumbered sailors by about 20 to 1. So it's much scarcer to find cards that were sent by sailors compared to cards that were sent by soldiers. This is a card that was sent from a sailor, and you can tell because it's got this sort of bland looking postmark. So what happened was if a sailor posted a card from a ship, when that ship came into port, all the mail that was taken off the ship was just stamped with these sort of mute cancels so that they wouldn't reveal the position of the ship. So there's no information about the ship or where it was posted on the front, but on the back the sailor has written HMS New Zealand. So I know it comes from a sailor who was working on the HMS New Zealand, and it's got his name down here, LV Edwards ERA. So I dug into this the story of the New Zealand a little bit. So the HMS New Zealand was actually a ship that was funded by the New Zealand government as a gift to Britain in like 1910, 1911. It was launched in 1911, I think, commissioned into the Royal Navy in 1912. And then in 1913, so this is all before the war, in 1913, it went on a tour around the world. And part of that tour was a 10-week visit to New Zealand, where they went all around New Zealand, and the people of New Zealand could go aboard the ship to inspect it. They called it inspection, but really they could go on to the ship and have a look at the ship because their government had paid for this ship. And so during this 10-week tour of New Zealand, about 500,000 New Zealanders went onto the ship, which was almost half of the population of New Zealand at that time. And so when you actually look at the message that the sailor has written, he wrote, "Having had the pleasure of bringing out this fine ship for your inspection, and looking forward with a bit of luck of paying a return visit in her after the war." So I hadn't really understood what that meant until I kind of looked into the history of this ship. So in fact, the sailor had been on the ship when She came to New Zealand in 1913. He was still on the ship in 1916 when this card was mailed. And I imagine that the donor who lived in New Zealand, so this was a donor, you know, it was mailed back to a donor in New Zealand, was probably one of the people who had gone onto the ship in 1913 when it was, you know, touring New Zealand as part of this inspection tour. So that's, you know, a really cool story behind this particular postcard. And then the last one that I'll show you, this is a really, really cool postcard that I bought, that I managed to get sort of indirectly through an auction. But so this is a card. It doesn't look much different from the other cards on the front. But the postmark is actually, so it's Field Post Office. It says PB33. So when I looked in my book that told me where all the field post offices were, it said PB33, and this was mailed in January 1919, so after the armistice. So PB33 was a field post office in Pechanga in North Russia. So it was on the coast near Finland, in North Russia, and the donor was in the Federated Malay States. So very uncommon post office, field post office, very uncommon destination. So the card is very cool already for those two reasons. But the really, really cool thing, which is why I really wanted this card, was so this is the scan of the back. And initially I didn't really know what it was. It was, you know, I asked one of my friends, he thought, well, it's going to the Malay States. Maybe it's like, you know, related to like one of the Malaysian languages or something, but we couldn't really, you know, he asked one of his friends and they didn't recognize it. And it looked a little bit Cyrillic to me. So he ended up asking, and I also asked a friend, and it turns out it's written in Serbian. So it's written in Serbian, it's signed by a Serbian soldier, and it says, basically it says, I give warmest thanks for friendship among allies. And so when you look into the history of it, so after the end of the First World War, there was what's called the Allied intervention in North Russia, where a lot of Allied troops of Britain, Canada, Serbia, obviously, sent troops to North Russia to fight alongside the White Russian troops, so the Tsarist loyalist troops, to help them fight against the Bolsheviks. And, you know, so the British soldiers and Serbian soldiers were fighting together in some places. And clearly, this card shows that a British soldier who had gotten smokes from this donor in the Federated Malay States had shared his smokes with the Serbian soldier, and the Serbian soldier was the one who was writing the thank you message to send back to the donor. You know, so it just shows, like, you know, these soldiers and how the smokes was like part of the soldier culture, and they shared everything. This is just an unrelated postcard I found of, you know, some British soldiers sharing smokes with French horsemen. So, you know, there's just this wonderful social history behind this card, where if you're only looking at the philatelic aspects, you'll completely miss the social history. So that's where, you know, that's what I find really cool. So that's kind of a very brief overview of this collecting area that I'm doing. I built a one frame exhibit, which I brought to Chicago PEX in November, basically telling the story with a little bit more detail than what I've gone over in this talk. But you can see it, you know, there's a lot of different cards that I've collected, but there's also some ephemera. There's a picture postcard. Here's a certificate that was given to school children in Britain when they brought in their pennies to contribute to the tobacco fund. Here's my little collection booklet for Belgian soldiers. So, you know, it tells this whole story, and there's the Serbian card at the back here. So if you're interested, I'm going to be giving a you know, more comprehensive talk on this topic in June for the British Empire Study Group. That's going to be online. It's free to register. You don't have to be a member. So that's, if you go to the British Empire Study Group website, you'll find the link for registering for this talk. And I think that's it. So thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.